Hello and welcome to this tutorial. I'm Neryl. A few years ago I shared a demo for the basics of texture drawing, so this time I'm going to get straight into the more advanced stuff that modern emulators make possible. Things like material maps and channel packing. Maps are texture files that provide information about how objects should be lit, allowing for the appearance of depth on surfaces that don't actually have any. In modern games, this saves the engine the trouble of rendering excessive polygons to create small details, but it's especially useful for an emulator like Dolphin. You can create the illusion of new geometry in games where it's otherwise not possible to actually add it. The main challenge of creating materials comes from the height map, a simple black and white image that records the depth of texture details. The logic is simple enough. Black is the deepest point of the image and white is the highest, with shades of gray covering every level in between. But how the base texture is drawn will dictate how hard creating the map will be. So when doing material maps, a few extra things have to be kept in mind. Any detail that doesn't affect the height of the surface should be kept on a separate layer that can be toggled off. An example of this would be a marbling pattern on stone. The surface of polished marble is even and the lines don't add any detectable bumps or dents, so a detail like that would need to be omitted from a height map. Keeping things on separate layers is a good habit anyway, but it's especially critical here. I don't claim to be an expert, and these probably aren't the best ways of doing things, or even right ways of doing things. But if you're interested in this kind of stuff, then maybe you'll enjoy seeing how it works.
Maybe I won't.
You can go to hell. I'll start with a Metroid texture from Skytown. I chose this one because it had a good variety of materials, but the ornate panel near the top was clearly recycled from another texture. After tracking that one down, it's clear to see that its design was pasted into the floor texture and then mirrored, so I'll have to do this texture first to get the complete design. The first thing I'll do is set GIMP symmetry mode to tile, then set the values to match the resolution of the image. It actually has to be 1 decimal point below or the value gets rejected. Doing this will let the brush wrap from one edge of the image to the other, which is a great help for drawing seamless textures. The next step is to trace the metalwork on a new layer. This is tedious work, but the pattern gets mirrored, so only 1/4 of it has to be traced. After flipping the design, it just takes a small adjustment to place the other half. The vertical bars in between the halves aren't symmetrical, so I'm leaving those out for now. After getting the ball rolling, I'm going to switch to the background layer to experiment with different metal types. It might seem haphazard to flit around like this, and it is, but for the sake of uniformity, I try to keep any part of the image from getting too far ahead of the others. I found some stock images that match my interpretation of the metal, and while I'm not going to use them, I do want to get a sense of what my design will look like on top of them. To draw the background I will use, I started with a bucket fill, and am using a brush set to value mode to lighten and darken it to match the SD texture. Back to the pattern, I'm going to bucket fill its value and color to match the coppery trim that outlines the shapes. Then use the select tool on an empty spot and grow it until it reaches about the inner edge of the trim. I'll feather this and then do a quick pass to shade the interior with values sampled from the original. I'll then grow a new selection to just reach the outermost edge of the trim and shade this to create slopes. The original texture didn't have these and the shape ended right at the trim, but I think showing more of the sides will help the maps deliver a 3D effect. I can also use an outliner plugin to make a quick drop shadow and get an even better sense of how the pattern is blending with the copper. I don't want all 4 quadrants to have the exact same shading, so I'm going to start mirroring the pattern before adding more specific details. Some excess needs to be trimmed near the center, and then I'll start on the middle bar to cover the seam. These shapes are easy to fill in and shade using rectangle selections. The dark grooves on the bar will need to be drawn on a new layer, and I'll also draw the highlights on their own layer. If these aren't disabled, they'll read as protruding lines on the height map. The bars at the top and bottom seem to be mirrored, so I'll start working on the bottom set first. This again is mostly a matter of using the rectangle tool and doing the crudest shading pass while keeping each major section on its own layer. I'll also take samples from the original to paint some of its colors in. I'm not sure if the orange boxes are supposed to be glossy or matte yet, so I'll just shade them close to the original with the gradient tool. After filling in the grooved pattern, I'll create some really quick shading by duplicating the layer twice, then making one copy black and the other white. The black version will be dragged upwards for shading, and the white will go below to resemble the edge catching light. I later learned that the lighting on this texture is flipped between the top and bottom halves, so on this half of the image the light source should actually be at the bottom. This doesn't matter much because the bar is so close to the ceiling that most of its light will be bouncing up from below anyway. I now make a mistake by shading the bar directly instead of using a new layer. This will come up when making the height map, and I totally did it on purpose to show how to deal with mistakes. You're the dumb one. Next, I'll fill in the missing pieces of the design in the same way as before. Once it's all accounted for, I'll experiment with another photo texture to add some corrosion. It needs to be made seamless, which I'm doing by using a soft brush on the edges and then merging two copies together. The layer offset tool makes it easy to center the seams and work on them, and I strongly recommend adding this to the toolbox if you use GIMP. This image again may not be used in the end, but for now it gives me a reference for the kind of corrosion I want. I'll start a new layer and draw my own wear using a variety of distressed brushes. Setting the brush dynamics to random will cause the rotation and size to cycle in a way that helps reduce repeated patterns. After making some color adjustments, I'll export the image to test what the game is doing with it. The texture is barely started yet, but it's still useful to check it even this early, as the bad tiling seam here demonstrates. It seems that I didn't account for the metalwork layers growing in size after being merged, so the layer offset tool didn't offset them from the edges of the canvas. You need to frequently test your texture so that small errors like this don't snowball into bigger problems. The background is once again falling behind, so I'm going to give it a pass of shading and add details like the center bar. The outline tool again makes it easy to add some ambient occlusion around the shape. There are also a lot of scuffs that suggest that pieces of the pattern have broken off and left a residue on the copper, as well as seams between the copper plates. Returning to the bars, the finished design will be mirrored and merged, and new layers will be added for more wear. This time I'm drawing dents and highlights on the same layer, which is a mistake I actually am making on purpose this time, as it's very easy to fix. The layer count is getting ridiculous, so some management will make things easier from here. I'll create layer groups for each of the different bars, which not only keeps things organized, but it will also make it easier to duplicate the lower bar and move all its layers to the top at once. Groups also limit certain layer types, like overlays, to applying only to the layers within the group, which is useful for adding shading to an object without darkening the layers below. The next step is to go around the metalwork and account for the differences between sections. While most shapes match up, the pattern isn't perfectly mirrored, and some sides are more damaged than others, so there's still a lot of work needed. Pieces are removed using layer masks so that all erasing is reversible, and the warp tool is used to mush the shapes into matching. I'll also start yet another layer for the metallic trim, which will help give this edge height when making the map. This one can also be mirrored, but will still take a lot of adjustment for each section. This is extremely laborious and not much fun. It may have been possible to use an edge detect filter to come up with these lines faster, but I wanted to keep full control over them. One easy to miss detail on the original texture are these pillars of light that fall on either side of the image, which I'll try to recreate with white paint on an overlay. My plan with the gilded trim layer is to create a drop shadow from it to suggest some height, and then to make it look more broken I'll duplicate the layer and mask out parts of it with a random pattern so that the highlights it brings are uneven. It's once again time to test it, and boy, I don't like that. After this much work, you should definitely create a backup of your project file, just in case. There's been progress, but the values and colors are still far off, so I'll start another pass of shading and... shit. GIMP does an autosave, so when it crashes, it's gone. It's like an old video game. If you didn't save it, the game is over. I assume I'll get some comments about why I'm using GIMP, and the answer is that it has a better interface than any premium program I've tried. Both Photoshop and Affinity Photo hide brush size and opacity behind clumsy dropdowns rather than displaying the bars at all times, and something that small does get cumbersome when you make dozens of adjustments a minute. Affinity also hides some settings in a dialog window that can't be docked and kept handy. Compared to these programs, GIMP's fully loaded windows make the workflow much faster, and from what I hear, Photoshop isn't exactly a respite from crashes anyway. It's time to start adding finer details now. While the background of the top half resembles shiny copper, I see the bottom as a rougher material, and I like to use one simple trick to add a lot of bumps fast. Doctors hate it. It takes a brush with small-sized splatters and dynamics set to random again, and in this case I removed pressure sensitivity in order to keep full opacity. I'm trying to distribute the marks evenly without filling the space too densely. The idea is to duplicate this layer and invert it, then drag the black copy until it resembles a shadow. You can also reverse the layers to create the illusion of holes or divots, with the white layer serving as a rim highlight. Some of the splatters I used are too large to work for this, but they can be split up with an eraser. In some cases it's better to use the warp tool to pull the shadows up rather than moving the entire layer, since that gives you some stretching. It also enables you to create directional shadows if the texture has a light source at a specific point. It's sloppy and quick, but I think the effect is really convincing. It's again important to keep these layers separate, since I'll only want the bumps on the height map and not the shadows. Putting them in their own group will let me adjust the overall opacity freely without changing the balance of light to shadow. From here it's just a matter of working the image with more shading and adjustment passes, adding more of the original details step by step. Doing faithful textures from the 6th generation on tends to be much more time-consuming than PlayStation or N64 ones, unsurprisingly, because the number of details to be faithful to has exploded. It's not as practical for a single person to retexture an entire game unless major shortcuts are taken on the quality or the original details are abandoned, which is something to keep in mind for anyone who wants to start a pack. It's finally time to start on the height map. I do not want to accidentally overwrite the main file, so I'll save a copy of the project with the word bump added before the extension to keep them separate. The first step is to convert to grayscale and start removing the layers that obviously don't belong, like ambient occlusion and highlights. Wear layers will need to be reduced in opacity relative to how deeply they deform their surfaces. A scratch shouldn't be nearly as dark as a lower layer of metal, for example. You need to visualize how these layers stack, and it's easiest to start with the highest and lowest points. The background is the lowest, so it should be nearly black, but not 100%. I need to leave room for variation on its surface. The top copper half needs to be darkened to the same value since it lies at the same depth. The bars are going to share the highest points, so their peaks need to be brightened to near white. Even if your texture doesn't have much depth, it's best to use the full range of values. This doesn't decide the depth the final texture will have, as that's done at the normal map stage. All you're marking is where the high and low points are, not how deep they are. I now have to fix and even out the values of the bars I shaded earlier, which is pretty easy to do using a soft brush and rectangle selections. I can remove the highlights I drew on the dent layer by simply setting the layer mode to darken only. I could also mask these out by adding a grayscale copy of the layer as a mask and then inverting it. What's tricky is balancing the different layers relative to one another. The orange boxes should be recessed slightly from the bar they rest in, but they also need to be higher than the metalwork design underneath. Comparing values from different layers with the eyedropper is important. In order for one layer to be higher than another, every value needs to be lighter than the lightest value of the layer below, and the bucket fill set to lighten only can help ensure this is the case. The layer created for the gilded trim will be the highest point of the metalwork, so it needs to be just a shade darker than the edge of the bars above it. It takes some back and forth to get an even gradation of values across the whole range. If this were a modern game, I might work this map more, but with Ishiruka's limited support, this should be good enough. The hard part is over, and creating the normal map is usually very easy. There are premium software options like Substance Designer that give a lot of control over every detail of the map, but you can also create one just fine in GIMP. After exporting the height map as a PNG, I'll load it and set the layer mode back to RGB. The tool can be found under Filters, Generic, Normal Map. You'll be given a preview of the map with a few options for the scale and inversions. The scale determines the level of depth the texture will have, so if you want very shallow details, keep it low, and crank it up for an aggressive 3D effect. Because you're adding modern effects to a game that was designed without them, I think it's usually best to go subtle and keep the impact on the visual style low. The invert options depend on the application the map is for. This is confusing, but different backends and programs need the channels to be prepared in different ways. DirectX needs the green or Y channel to be flipped relative to OpenGL. Ishiruka uses the DirectX format, but apparently also requires the red channel to be flipped. The Y channel is set correctly when green appears on the lower side of protruding objects. I'll then export the map with NRM added before the extension, making sure not to overwrite the height map. If you get this wrong, it's possible to fix without generating the normal map over again. GIMP has a feature under Colors, Components, Decompose that will separate the RGB channels into layers. You can then invert any channel you need to fix, then use Recompose from the same drop-down menu to reassemble the map. Materialize is another free option with much fuller controls than GIMP. The downside is its unintuitive interface. You load your height map by clicking O in the designated box, then click Create in the normal map box. You can set the depth using the sliders or the preset options, depending on how fancy you're feeling. No one seems to know what the sliders do, and the devs didn't explain it because they hate you, so just eyeball it. For better visualizations, you can also load the base texture in the diffuse box and a spec map in the metallic box, then click Show Full Material to see how it all works together. You can't really adjust the depth while this view is active though. When done, click S in the normal box to save. The final map is for specular highlights, and it determines how reflective surfaces will be. White will be as shiny as possible, while black will be dull and matte. For this, I also start by saving a grayscale copy of the base texture, this time adding Spec before the extension. The gilded trim layer will once again be important, and for a metallic look I'll make it the brightest part of the map. Unlike the height map, the grime layers are very important here and are best kept at high opacity. Usually what I want will be given by the existing layers of shading, since corroded areas shouldn't reflect as much and the grungy spots will darken themselves in. The stone bars should fall below the middle values, and I think the orange boxes should be glassier, so they'll be boosted up. The corroded areas on the copper background will also need to be darkened in to create a contrast with a clean metal. Once this map is exported, you should compress the materials for use in Ishiruka. This will leave you with only 2 files that take up less than half the size. The files will have to be named correctly, which is just a matter of adding a decimal before the bump, NRM, and spec extensions I already added to the file names. With all the textures in the same folder, the encoder just needs to be launched and set to use DDS compression. The resulting files then just go into Dolphin's load folder, like a normal PNG. Metroid unfortunately only has partial support for maps, so they'll only show when a light source is nearby, which is why belaboring the maps wasn't worth the time, but they are very plain to see when lit. I created normal maps using 3 different programs, and as you can see, there isn't a gigantic difference in quality. Sometimes one method yields better results than another, but you definitely don't need to pay anything to get decent quality maps. After seeing the maps, there's always some adjusting and balancing that needs to be done, but that's basically it for this texture. Now I can use the design to start working on the image I actually wanted to. It takes a lot of time, but there's an economy of scale when doing a texture pack, where you'll be able to copy and paste the assets you've made into dozens of variants and finish areas more and more quickly as you go. This isn't the most advanced stuff out there when it comes to modding retro games, but it's about as far as you can push a texture pack at the moment. To get even more complicated, I chose a texture from the beloved Space Rodents series. The 3DS has similar texture resolutions to the GameCube, but the mappings are much more efficient and probably automated by software, so the textures don't make as much sense to the eye. Objects will be interrupted and scattered across the image in pieces, so HD textures require pixel-perfect precision to reassemble correctly. The textures are also often hard to see, with high transparency that leaves only a few details visible. There are also at least a few normal maps in most games, meaning that you also have details to be faithful to when creating materials. Unlike Dolphin, you're not just winging it and creating your own thing. Speaking of winging it, the Arwing is a good showcase for all of these problems. Weird pieces, low opacity, and normal maps. The first task is to dump textures from every Arwing before starting anything, since the game has at least 3 variants. The title screen is the best quality, using a surprisingly large 1024 by 512 texture with a matching res normal map, and using this as a base will make the details easier to read than the gameplay version. Transparent textures like these are using channel packing to hide a spec map. Most textures have 4 channels available: red, green, blue, and an alpha for transparency. But outside of decals and flash effects, few textures actually need transparency. Instead of letting the channel go to waste, 3DS games use it to pack a spec map into the base texture. The spec map usually works the same way I showed in Dolphin. Dark is matte, white is shiny, and those values are basically applied to the texture as a mask. So the first step is to remove the mask and make the texture visible. In GIMP, this can be done by right-clicking the layer and adding a mask that transfers the alpha channel. With the spec map now separated, you can choose to disable it to see the full image, or click Show to view the spec map itself. Exporting with the mask disabled demonstrates its effect. A fully opaque image means the alpha channel is pure white, so the Arwing is entirely shiny. For now, I can keep it disabled and worry about it later. I'll use bright colors to identify the parts of the ship and how they map, and create labels to keep track of them. High-tech machinery needs clean and precise lines, so I'll be using the lasso and path tools heavily to create the shapes. To keep things symmetrical, I'll also sometimes draw half the shape, then flip it from the exact center to make the other half. I need a reference before I can start adding details, and 64 and 0 are the only games with this style Arwing. The original renders haven't held up well in my opinion, and the boxy lines look artificially busy. There's a lot of detail, but it's just meaningless squiggles. The 3DS art is a lot more modern and clean, while 0 is somewhere in between. I like the updated patterns on the 0 ship, but the mapping will likely make it difficult to add all of them, so I'm mostly sticking with the 3DS version, but I do want to keep the N64 events. I'll keep the references open and check them often while adding details. In addition to the path tool, I can also use the Gfig filter to create simple shapes, like perfect triangles. This isn't really necessary, but it's a foolproof way to get the angles exactly right. Even at 8x resolution, details like the triangles and decals have very few pixels to work with. For almost anything else I would double the res, but there's never really a time when the Arwing is still enough to get a good look, so this should be okay. Each side of the body is split up into halves. I'll bucket fill a lasso select again, and then stroke in the panel seams with the path tool. These gaps are recessed, so this layer will be important for the height map. There are more opportunities to add details from the promo render on the nose. Whether these survived once mapped onto the model is another matter, so I'll have to do another test before going further. It gets a little warped, but most of it seems to hold up. The N64 style vents will be made with one layer for the bars and one for the recess, and the body shading will be painted on its own value layer, again for the sake of easy removal on the height map. I'll also try to add some blue where light should be bouncing off the blasters. It's difficult to check the progress due to the map still being SD, but I can tell that I'm on the right track. After getting one piece done, I can clone it to finish the other side quickly, but it has to be placed very carefully. I'll copy one section from the original texture, using a selection to keep the size the same as my layer, and then check exactly how many pixels the transformation needs to be moved by to line up. After that, I can duplicate and flip my entire layer group the same way. The rest is drawn mostly the same way, and I think you get the gist of it now, so I'm going to skip ahead to drawing the blasters. Instead of using the default colors, I'm going to push the highlights towards green, because I think metallic sheens are more convincing with a range of hue changes. The art provides a lot of details for these, with decals and text that aren't present in any other renders. I'm going to go for it and add them. The layers can be disabled if I change my mind. The text on the sticker near the vent isn't very clear, but considering that the same image spells caution two different ways, I assume it's nothing important, so squiggles will do. Rotating this layer didn't work out for the text, so everything has to be flipped in order to work. Even after a lot of mapping tests, there can still be some surprises. The joint between the blaster halves had a lot of mechanical detail on 64, but 3D leaves it almost entirely blank. I want to add at least a few grooves into it using similar patterns to the rest of the Arwing. I think the lasers should come out of something, and reference images and 3D prints mostly show gun barrels placed there. I'm not sure if that will work without some geometry there for the barrel, so I'm going to try something more like 64, where the blaster port had something resembling a gold contact in it. I think that works and doesn't stand out too much if you're not looking for it. Smash that dislike button if you don't agree. Pattern filters can be useful for creating translucent looking lights. I'm going for some kind of vague LED array under the plastic. I don't know. It's the future. I can do whatever I want. The last major piece is the absurd little 2D pilot in the cockpit. This will barely be seen by the player, but if I'm going to draw it, I want to draw it right, so I looked up references for Fox's jumpsuit and the control panel. The first-person mode in the original shows a mess of mechanical junk inside, but the anime for Zero gives clear views of both the monitor and the flight sticks. I'm going to add the pockets, patches, and buckles on his suit, and even a cloth texture using a hatching brush. It looks like Fox is holding one big handlebar in the old texture, so I want to make sure the separate sticks are distinct and with all the right buttons. Is it necessary to add so much detail when it will almost never be seen? No, but that's why I make the big bucks. After adding a glow effect from the monitor, it's time to move on to the maps. I'll start with a spec map this time since it's part of the base texture, again working on a new copy of the project file. The Arwing appears glossy and new in the art for the 3D release, but in almost every other piece of media it's grungy and beaten up. I think they were definitely inspired by the look of the X-Wings from that series that, in the end, is all about family, so I'm going to choose a duller look for the body panels. I've chosen a value below gray and will bucket fill all of the main panels down to it, and the dark grooves will mostly take care of themselves. I want those to be the most matte. The red arrows and exhaust vents will get lighter shades to reflect more. The blasters will be more metallic and reflective, so they'll be one of the brightest spots, and the absolute peak will be the chrome cylinders at the top. The gold contacts I added to the blasters will also be bright. All of the grime layers should be strong enough to create a clear drop in surface polish, and in some cases I have to double them up to get there. The original spec map has a bright edge surrounding each piece, and because I'm still not totally sure how the 3DS processed its maps, I'm going to include that on a new layer to be safe. I'll select the negative space between parts and feather it heavily, then bucket fill white on a new layer. I'll then select the negative space again, but this time only feather it to 2 and cut, leaving me with a glow around the rim of each object. Once the map is done, I'm going to export the base texture to a PNG file, then open it and paste the spec map in as a mask. It doesn't really matter what type of mask I start with, but I'm choosing a grayscale copy of the layer to show how much the map changed from its starting point. The height map is more confusing this time, since there are numerous planes at different heights and angles in this texture. It's difficult to reverse engineer what an original height map would have looked like, so I used a feature in Substance Designer to generate a height map from the normal. This isn't very trustworthy and I see some spots that are obviously wrong, but it does provide clues about what the values should be. Materialize is also very helpful for this. I can load the original texture and normal map, then rotate the model to see where the depth is being added. Normal maps are often baked down from high poly models, and will include a lot more detail than just the surface variations I've demonstrated so far, and that seems to be what this map is doing. Recreating all of that by hand will be tough, so for now I'm just going to focus on the depth of the surfaces rather than the polygons. The main panels will all get a neutral gray and the seams will be a small amount darker. I'll save the darkest values for the vents and holes. Based on the normal map, I know that the blaster pieces have height, so I'll add a gradient layer to shade them as they go up. I'm also going to push the cockpit values further. It won't be very precise, but the floor should be the lowest, the hands should be above the sticks, the collar should be above the hands, etc, etc. After this I can export the height map and start generating a normal. I won't know until seeing it in-game, but the 3D appearance of Fox tells me that Daddy done good. The default maps have a yellow appearance because they lack a blue channel. This can be generated by the game engine, so the developers traded an increase in processing load for the sake of reducing texture size. I can export a map without doing the same, but since the blue channel won't be used anyway, I may as well remove it and reduce my file size as well. I can do this by using the decompose feature again and filling the blue channel with black. After recomposing, the map should resemble the original. Testing the results, I can see way too much high-frequency detail. Some of this comes from banding caused by the 8-bit depth of the GIMP image, but most of it is from the damage layers being kept too high. I'd have used a higher bit depth, but funny story, it makes GIMP crash. It's difficult to find a balance where the depth resembles the original without leading to excessive bumps, so I'm going to reduce the overall depth and keep it that way. With the extra detail in the base texture, the normal map doesn't need to carry as much weight to sell the depth of the lines and vents. I'm also going to blend two maps together for the final result, one with high depth and one with low, so that I can keep the deep modeling on some parts without adding too many bumps to the flat panels. The results aren't perfect, but I'm satisfied with it. Citra still has a lot of problems with this game and the shading is buggy, but I think the improvements are visible enough. I'll stress again that this likely isn't the best way to do any of this, and it doesn't reflect how modern developers work. They've moved on to PBR and other methods. In a few years, even emulators should have much better enhancement options, but this is what it looks like to push the software we have now. If you, precious viewer, have considered doing a project of your own, it's vital that you enjoy the process enough that the work becomes its own reward. I say this as one of the 4 people that has ever finished a texture pack. The amount of effort required shouldn't put you off. It should be part of the fun. Except when it sucks, then it's bullshit. Well, pass your work forward and let's see how you did. This one is from Crystal, and I can definitely see Skytown in there. I think a few details are missing, but this is a good start. This Arwing is from Jonzo. There's a strong sense of scene here. I think Fox has been reduced a little too much, but I get it. Maximum Dong has gone the other way with this one. There's a lot of Fox here. It's all accounted for. This is Pizza's take. Interesting choice to go 3D. My main advice would be to make it suck less, in this region. And finally we have